benzagura pema sidi hung nahung benzagura pema sidi nahung benzagura pema sidi hung. Welcome everyone to my Sunday Dark Monday this weekend. I apologize for the change of time. I hope it hasn't inconvenienced anyone. We had a long weekend here in Canada, and I had some distractions on the weekend, which just made it impossible for me to put the finishing touches on my talk yesterday. So I thought, since I am here today anyway, since today was a holiday, I might as well give the talk today, and then we can continue on with the next Sutta next Sunday. So this is not a normal thing. We will be returning to our normal time next Sunday at 2:00 p.m. Second Lifetime. And we are, of course, discussing the suttas of the Digha Nikaya. We're proceeding through all 34 suttas, one sutta per week. So, I did put my information. Yes, I did. Okay, so there you've got my information in the nearby chat. So let's proceed with the topic of today's talk, which is the Janavasabha Sutta, which is the 18th sutta in the Digha Nikaya. The Buddha is staying at the brick house in Nadaka, where he also stayed in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, you will recall, while he was making his tour prior to his death. You will recall that the Buddha foretold the rebirths of many people in that community. This sutta elaborates that story, as the previous sutta elaborated Ananda's objection to the Buddha dying near Kusinara, which we discussed last time. As Walsh points out in a footnote, the Magadhans were not mentioned initially. Ananda points this out as a defect, since many Magadhans were Buddhist, including King Bimbisara, recently killed by his son Ajatasattu, as I have mentioned in a previous talk. Ananda also notes that the Buddha became enlightened in Magadha at Bodh Gaya. The ability to discern the karmic fate of individuals is the ninth power of a Buddha, called the divine eye. And there's a point about Magadha that you might be wondering about from one or two talks ago. I mentioned that Magadha is of the different Mahajanapadas, the 16 great republics that existed in northeast India at that time. Magadha is the one where the Buddha spent the most time and was and therefore the most important to him. And you may wonder why that is so, given that I characterized it in a previous talk as a fascist dictatorship. And while that is true, it was what we would call fascist or military dictatorship. It also had the seeds of republicanism, that is to say, a democratic social organization within it. Not at the state level, obviously, but at what we would call the municipal level, at the level of villages. A lot of the organization and decision-making was, in fact, quite democratic. And that is one of the reasons why the Buddha was drawn to it, since the Buddha did support the various nascent democratic republics in that area, including the Vrajis, for example. So that's the reason, possibly one reason, maybe perhaps there are others, but that's at least one reason why the Buddha was attracted to Magadha. After completing his alms round, perhaps late in the morning or just afternoon, the Buddha sits down in meditation in the brick house and determines to discern the future lot and destiny of the Magadhans as Ananda has requested, including King Bimbisara. If you've read the sutta, you'll recall that Ananda made that request of the Buddha because in the discussion in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, he doesn't actually include any Magadhans in his divination, I guess you could call it. So Ananda requested that he make predictions about the future rebirths of the Magadhans as well. And in the early evening, when the sun is still able to cast a shadow, the Buddha comes out and sits in the shade. Ananda comes to him and notes that his face is bright and shining, a characteristic that is associated in other suttas with meditative attainment and death. Here Ananda associates it with the Buddha's mind being tranquil. So we can see that there's a tradition here that's being drawn upon, that death, meditation, tranquility, such states of mind are discernible in the brightness of the complexion of the face. The Buddha tells him that during his meditation he heard the voice of a yaksha, a class of nature spirit that guards natural treasures hidden in the earth and tree roots. There are two kinds of yaksha. This one is a nature fairy associated with woods and mountains. A darker version is a kind of ghost that haunts wilderness areas and waylays and devours travelers. In Buddhist cosmology, they attend Vesavana, the guardian of the northern direction in the realm of the four great kings, which is the realm next above our own world. Those of you who have attended my talks in Buddhist cosmology will recall the realm of the four great kings. The yaksha identifies himself as Janavasabha. Janavasabha. Afterwards, the Buddha asks Ananda if he has heard of him. Although Ananda has not heard the name, for some reason the name excites in him emotions of both fear and respect. The yaksha appears before the Buddha in what is termed a noble vision, adding again further insight into our understanding of the altered states of consciousness which were being cultivated by the ancient Buddhists. In a noble vision, he identifies himself as the dead king Bimbisara himself. So this is an apparition of the dead king, who, as I mentioned, was murdered by his son. He tells the Buddha that this is his seventh rebirth in the realm of the four great kings, both as a king and as a messenger of the guardian of the north. Interestingly, Bimbisara / Janavasabha mentions that he can recall 14 rebirths, that is to say 14 of his past lives. Thus, although Devas typically recall their past lives, such recall is limited, presumably according to their station in the Deva worlds. Human beings only rarely recall their past lives. Bimbisara / Janavasabha identifies himself to the Buddha as a stream enterer, or winner, stream winner in Walsh's translation. Enter is a little more literal, who will achieve nirvana within 7 human rebirths. And he tells the Buddha that he desires to build up the merit to become a once-returner. A once-returner has but 1 human rebirth remaining before achieving emancipation. The Buddha is astonished by Bimbisara / Janavasabha's claim, quote, "On what grounds can he know of such an august specific attainment?" Unquote, referring, of course, to Bimbisara Janavasabha in the third person. Bimbisara Janavasabha says that it is by the Buddha's teaching that he knows, referring perhaps to the mirror of Dharma practice described in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which you may recall is a practice whereby one can know that one has entered the stream, or is a stream winner. The stream enterer is identified as being free from all evil, all future states of woe and subhuman rebirths by having stricken off the 3 fetters of belief in a self, belief in rites, rituals, morality, and uncaused salvation, that's one thing, and doubt. Belief in a self, belief in rites, rituals, morality, and uncaused salvation, and doubt. These are the 3 fetters referred to in the Sutta but not described, but those are what they refer to. Those are the 3 fetters that keep us, impede one from becoming a stream winner or enterer. So those are the fetters that must be overcome in order to become a stream winner or a stream enterer. Bimbisara proceeds to tell the Buddha the story of an assembly of the Devas in the realm of the 33 gods on the full moon Uposita of the rainy season, or Vasa, which means it was probably in July, quote-unquote, in earlier times. I haven't looked at the Pali of that, whether the word kalpa is used, but it's probably referring to kalpas ago, not a previous time in our age, but another kalpa altogether, another epoch of historical time. And, of course, the Devas are what are normally translated as gods in the texts, higher spiritual beings. seated in the Sudama Hall, that is literally the Hall of Good Counsel, including many other devas and devas of the realm of the four great kings, and 2,400 devas who had been Magadhan disciples of the Buddha at that time. The faces of the devas that were disciples of the Buddha were brighter than the others were, causing the 33 devas to rejoice that the ranks of the devas are increasing, while the ranks of the asuras are declining. So we need to unpack that statement. The ranks of the devas are increasing while the ranks of the asuras are declining. Some of you will have attended past talks in which I have discussed the asuras and the devas at some length. However, for those of you who are perhaps not privy to those talks, I am going to go into it again here in the context of the Digha Nikaya, since this is the first reference to asuras, I believe, in the Digha Nikaya. So in order to decode the previous reference to the devas and the asuras, to which, as I said, this appears to be the first reference in the Digha Nikaya, we're going to discuss the war between the devas and the asuras. The realm of the 33 gods, the polar center of the physical universe, used to be inhabited by the anti-gods, the asuras, which now stand midway between the hells and the ghosts. But the asuras were expelled in prehistory due to their competitive and desirous nature. And you'll find a story, interestingly, you'll find a story like this, of course, in the Middle Eastern legends, in our own tradition, referring to the Judeo-Christian tradition, of course, there's the legend of Satan and the fallen angels. The chief of this realm is Sakra, a Buddhist variation of Indra, the Hindu chieftain god, who cast the anti-gods out. I'm going to use the term anti-god in this talk for Asura. Nevertheless, it is considered a fortunate dimension. In fact, more fortunate because the Asuras were cast out, at least from the perspective of the Devas. The inhabitants of this realm are also involved in human affairs. The realm of the 33 gods is similar to heaven in the Judeo-Christian tradition, with the realm of the anti-gods corresponding quite closely with hell. Both the Semites and the Aryans believed that gods and other supernatural beings walk among us, usually invisibly, but they are capable of assuming a physical presence. And this was, interestingly, the basis of the ancient custom of hospitality, which pretty much universally characterized all ancient societies. Whereas human beings inhabit 4 great continents in the one world ocean that surrounds the base of Mount Sumeru, the Asuras inhabit the ocean itself immediately around the base. The word Asura was supposed to mean non-Asura, or non-Sura, rather. That is, not Asura, which was a synonym for Deva, literally a shining being or an energy being of light. When you read those references in the translations to gods, keep in mind that literally these are shining or luminous beings or energy beings or beings of light. The word God is somewhat misleading in English implication, and the word Deva can also be translated as celestial dweller or star. So the Devas are the stars of heaven, as it were. Asura is often translated Titan, demigod, anti-god, or demon. The Asuras are described as addicted to the passions of wrath, pride, envy, insincerity, falseness, boasting, and bellicosity. They are dominated by ego, force, and violence. At least some Asuras are actually malevolent. As with all of the 6 classes of sentient beings, Asuras may be reborn as human beings, and human beings may be reborn as Asuras. Because humans and Asuras occupy essentially the same plane, that is, the one world ocean surrounding the base of Mount Sumeru, there is considerable friction between them. Asuras enjoy a much more pleasurable life than humans do, but they are plagued by envy for the Devas. Asuras and human beings are alike in that we have both shared a similar fate. Both human beings and the Asuras originally occupied a much higher realm in the Buddhist hierarchy. Asuras originally lived in the realm of the 33 gods on the peak of Mount Sumeru, but they were cast down to the foot of the mountain due to their drunkenness. Thus, the Asuras and the Devas of the 33 gods engage in constant conflict in which human beings also become embroiled. Asuras perceive devas in the same way that animals perceive humans. Humans perceive animals consistently, mostly, unless they are very small, but devas and asuras only rarely. Asuras are often confused with hell beings, but they are a distinct group, and they are a distinctly more spiritually advanced than hell beings in particular. In fact, there is an asura spirituality which is in competition with the deva spirituality. And those of you who are familiar with the work of Aleister Crowley, I see the question there. I'll just finish my sentence and I'll look at it. Those of you who might be familiar with the work of Aleister Crowley have in fact been introduced to what may be described as an asura spirituality. And I believe that, in fact, during his life, in the Theosophical Press, articles did appear about Crowley which were making this exact assertion, that what he was promoting was an asura spirituality, that is, in a spirituality based on passion, sexuality, worldliness, etc. Now, and power, of course, as well. Aglow Phoenix asks, since anti-gods are advanced and live in the water, is there any connection with the Nagas? No. The Nagas are a distinct class of snake-like being. I believe the Nagas are technically part of the four great kings, the realm of the four great kings. They are a bit asura-like in that they are morally ambivalent and, morally ambivalent. I guess that's how they're like. They're similar in that respect. But technically, they're not. Nagas are not asuras. They are, I believe. I can check that afterwards to be absolutely certain, but I'm reasonably sure that they are considered to be part of the four great kings. The entities of the four great kings are nature spirits of various types. So elves, fairies, gnomes, goblins, tree spirits, etc. The asuras were not always regarded as evil beings. In the Rig Veda, which is dated between the age of the Rig Veda is approximately 1500 to 1000 before the Common Era, asuras were a type of deva, such as Asura Varuna, the god of the celestial ocean, the underwater world, law and order, moral and societal affairs, and nature. Asuras, the word literally means lord. The asura or non-sura etymology is actually a speculative etymology. The more correct etymology is that it means lord, were originally a term associated with individual devas, not a class of beings in their own right. So some devas were simply called asura such and such, lord such and such. And asuras became a distinct class of being during the late Vedic period, between 1000 before the Common Era and 500 before the Common Era, approximately. Originally, the asuras were the older and stronger siblings of the devas, powerful and benevolent. The later Vedic texts begin to document a conflict between the asuras and the devas, in which the asuras were invariably victorious. According to the Bhagavad Gita, the asuras are described as vicious, proud, arrogant, conceited, angry, harsh, and ignorant. This reflects a growing conflict between the older dominant cult of asura worship and a newer but rising cult of deva worship. Originally, the asuras were non-anthropomorphic and formless gods, in contradistinction to the more anthropomorphic devas. The asuras were the guardians of the natural and moral laws of Rita, the great principle of cosmic order that regulates and coordinates the operation of the universe, comparable to dharma and karma. The deva worshippers, on the other hand, were concerned with power, might, fear, submission, and the status quo. Interestingly, it was also during the late Vedic period that women were stripped of their traditional rights and privileges and demoted to the status of property, something the Buddha opposed, but which was reinstated immediately after his death or parinirvana about the year 400 before the Common Era, by the Arhants of the First Buddhist Council. And I've discussed this at some length in previous talks, for those of you who have attended those talks. And now, also, with respect to the question about the Nagas, something else has just occurred to me. Nagas are morally ambivalent, so sometimes they're nice, sometimes they're not so nice. but they're also capable of aspiration. And there's a story in which when the Buddha was meditating, it began to rain, and a naga in the form of a cobra, they were most often associated with cobras, stretched his hood over the Buddha's head to protect him from the rain. I think that was during his enlightenment experience. And that is not something that you would ever find an asura, an action that you would ever see assigned to an asura. Rather, the asura in the Buddha's life was Mara, the demon Mara, who tried to tempt him away from enlightenment. So there you can see a very definite difference between the level of the Nagas and the level of the Asuras. The division between the Asura and Deva worshippers appears to correspond to a social schism that occurred during the late Vedic period. That's 1,000 to they say 1,000 or 1,500 to 500 BCE, and culminated in the Samana culture, counterculture rather, of the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. And Aglo Phoenix says, it is historically attested that the gods of the old culture become the demons of the new. Yes, and I'm going to mention that shortly. That's exactly it. There was some kind of cultural revolution during the late Vedic period, which from out of which the Brahmins and the dominance of the Brahmanic caste emerged. And a lot of these negative characteristics that we associate with Brahmanism, the misogyny, the authoritarianism, the racism, I guess, call it the racism of the caste system, this all developed later. This is a later development in Indian culture. Originally, Indian culture, it's been noted that of the ancient cultures, most of them started as being anti-liberal and then over time became progressively more liberal. In the case of the Indian culture, the Indus Valley civilization was very liberal, and then over time it became less liberal. So Indian civilization has had an opposite tendency over historical time. It's a tendency towards less and less liberalism, more and more conservatism, as distinct from the other ancient cultures. That's not my idea. I'm citing someone who mentions this. The division between the Asura and Deva worshippers appears to correspond to a social schism that occurred during the late Vedic period and culminated in the Samana counterculture of the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era. I assume everyone here now is familiar with Samana, the word Samana. We've discussed that before. That's the ascetic counterculture that the Buddha joined, essentially, when he left home. The schism was associated with two classes of Vedic deity, the Asuras and the Devas, also known as Suras. Originally, the Asuras, as I said, literally means Lord, were a class of superior Devas who inhabited the realm of the 33 gods, the Trias Trimsa, on top of Mount Meru, or Sumeru. In Buddhism, the Asuras are seen as inferior deities who are never satisfied and who always strive to improve themselves. This is paradoxical, however, because the Buddha opposed the Brahmanic establishment based on caste, supported by the Deva worshippers, as a degenerate remnant of the primordial tradition that the Buddha sought to restore. So there's a little bit of a paradox in there, and maybe a little bit of rewriting of the Pali Canon even. It doesn't matter so much, though, because for us, these are merely abstract categories that we don't really associate with individuals, because although, what I'm about to discuss, the individuals who were affected by this social revolution are different in the West and in the East, as I'm about to explain, the concept of Deva and Asura remains. So for us, it's really the concept of the duality of Deva and Asura, not so much who's who is which is who. Because and the reason I mention that is because the schism reflects a conflict between the adherents of the old gods that continues today, as someone just mentioned. One finds a similar conflict in Egyptian mythology, in which the old gods, like Set, precursor of the Hebrew Satan, now associated with evil, were originally not regarded as evil at all. They were primordial, not evil. This principle of cosmic conflict became entrenched in later religions, such as Zoroastrianism and Christianity as well. In the Iranian tradition, the Asuras, especially Asura or Ahura Mazda, the word's undergone a bit of a linguistic transformation there, but its origin in Asura, the origin of the word Ahura in Ahura Mazda in the word Asura is obvious, who is the personification of wisdom. In the Iranian tradition, they retained their privileged status, and it was the Devas who were demonized and cast down. So there was obviously a war in one part of the country. One group won, and the other part of the country, the other group won. Of course, the war took place in the symbolic imagination of the people, but that does not mean that it was any less significant or real to those people. The names of many asuras refer to natural abstractions, rather as in Native American spiritualism, Indus Valley civilization, etc. A new cult of Deva worship emerged during the late Vedic period that declared the asuras to be demonic and began to persecute the older group of asura worshippers. The new Deva worshippers were authoritarian. They were fundamentalists, basically. They were authoritarian fundamentalists. They supported the superiority of the Brahmins, the caste system, and they were misogynistic, intensely misogynistic. The conflict between the Asura and Deva worshippers was mythologized. In the eastern part of the Indian subcontinent, the Deva worshippers achieved preeminence, whereas in the west, the Asura worshippers maintained their prestige, demonizing the Devas in return. The latter became the foundation of Zoroastrianism in Iran, with the supreme god Ahura, or Asura Mazda, the god of wisdom, at its head. This period was also a period characterized by a great mythological war between two groups of divinities, the Devas, the shining ones, and the Asuras, literally lords, but interpreted based on etymology, which means anti-gods. I'm repeating myself a bit here because I pulled some of this material out of previous talks. The Asuras seem to be associated with vast cosmic and natural powers, older and more powerful than the Devas. The explanation for why the Devas were able to overcome them and cast them down from the plane of the 33 gods is that they were drunk on Amrita, interestingly, for those of you who attended my talk on Amrita, suggesting a connection between the downfall of the Asuras and the forgetting of Soma, and I'm asking that as a question. I don't know, but there seems to, because this is also the period during which the memory of the Soma recipe has been forgotten as well. So it seems that Vedic civilization is undergoing a degeneration here, where the original sacrament of the culture has been forgotten. Actual spiritual experience is being replaced by dogma and ritual, and social organization is becoming more authoritarian, more static, more militaristic. And of course, all this evolved into the system which the Buddha encountered in the system of warring states, which basically constituted the 16 great republics. A very violent and dangerous time, in fact. The Asuras were cast down into the cosmic ocean, where, together with the Devas, they churned the cosmic ocean for Soma. And this is also interesting. I'm not going to go more into it here, but it's interesting that the Asuras are needed to create Soma. It isn't just the Devas who create Soma. It's the conflict between the Asuras and the Devas which churns the cosmic ocean and out of which Soma arises. I can't explain that symbolically any further than that, but it is very interesting, and probably has all sorts of psychological implications. If we identify the Devas of the 33 gods, and also probably developed, it has something to do with the development of Tantra as well, because Tantra has a kind of Asura kind of orientation if you look at it. If we identify the devas of the 33 gods with the force of negentropy, the tendency to order, and the realm of the asuras with the force of entropy, the tendency to disorder, we see that the war of the devas and the asuras is a metaphor, amongst other things, for the dualistic dynamic of the universe, raging between energy, information, negentropy, and matter, ignorance, entropy. The Dharma, therefore, represents the action of the negentropic principle in a universe ruled by entropy. R. Buckminster Fuller was perhaps the first modern to recognize that humans fulfill a natural negentropic function within the universe, and that insight is actually very similar to the Buddhist insight of the importance of human beings in the process of salvation. That is, that the human beings have this special intermediate position between the devas and the hell beings, which gives them a special opportunity, as it were, to achieve emancipation. Maya Phoenix says perhaps that conflict was needed for the dialogue between the two. There obviously is something there. I mean, I would have to study it at a much greater length in order to really speak intelligently about what that churning of the ocean, quote-unquote, actually means. From perhaps a Jungian perspective, that is how I would go at it if I were to but I would want to research it a lot further before I would try to present any kind of opinion as to the meaning of that mythologem. But it is a very interesting one. Allison says, you seem uncertain. Quote, conflict was needed for the dialogue between the two. Does that make sense? Okay, I think I just addressed that. I am uncertain because I don't know the mythology deeply enough to really go into it any more deeply than I have. So I hesitate to speculate about what it means beyond what I've already said. It would be a very interesting thing to study and write a paper about, perhaps even give a talk on that topic. Perhaps you would be interested in doing that, either here or at Zhangzhung, the official sim of the Dharma transmission to the West group. If you would be interested in writing a talk, researching that, and writing a talk on it, I'd be happy to host it. So, that's it for the discussion of the devas and the asuras. So we're going to go on to discuss the assembly of the 33 devas. In the course of their deliberations, a light appears in the north. Sakka declares, quote, when such signs are seen, Sakka, of course, being the head of the 33 devas, the chief of the realm of the 33 devas, or 33 gods, Sakka declares, quote, when such signs are seen, such light is seen, and such radiance shines forth, Brahma will appear, unquote. We have encountered this association of the imminent appearance of the chief of the Brahma worlds with unpredictable luminous phenomena before, in a previous sutta, reminiscent of the near-death phenomenon, or NDE. All of the devas declare in unison, quote, or not in unison, but they have a discussion and they agree, quote, let us find out what comes of this radiance, and having found the truth of it, we will go towards it, quote unquote. Kumara also means gold, and the Sutta says that he outshone the devas like a gold statue outshines the human figure. I'm just looking at, because I see question marks in the chat. Is the holding of hands a symbolic gesture for humans? The holding of hands a symbolic gesture for humans? Not quite sure what that's referring to. So if you can elaborate the relevance of that question or explain what you're getting at with that, perhaps I can address it later in the talk. And let me change the slide. There he is, Sanat Kumara. The Brahma, Sanat Kumara, appears before the assembly of the 33 gods. Sanat Kumara has come up in previous talks, but I think that this is his first appearance in the Digha Nikaya. Sanat Kumara, in Sanskrit, his name means eternal child. In himself, Sanat Kumara was imperceptible, but by assuming a coarse form, he was able to make himself perceptible to the assembly. Brilliant to behold, he outshone all the other devas and encouraged them to follow the Buddhist Dharma, and actually, that sentence I read before about Kumara is out of place. Let me just fix that. So when I mentioned that the Kumara also means gold, and that the Sutta says the outshone the devas like a gold statue outshines the human figure, that's actually with reference to Tseten Kumara, not with reference to Saka. Sanat Kumara is one of the four Kumaras. Four sages or rishis who wander the universe together as divine children. You'll notice a lot of Hinduism in the Pali Canon, or a lot of Indian mythology in the Pali Canon. There are Buddhists who would like to expunge Indian tradition from the Pali Canon. But if you look at the Pali Canon in its entirety, it's impossible to do. It's clear that the Buddha was an Indian, and he existed in a cultural context like everyone does. And there are many Indian references throughout the Pali Canon. Despite the will of some academics, I might mention Suwanda H.J. Sugunasiri as an example, who would like to eliminate the Buddha's Indian cultural context from the Pali Canon. I think that is a futile endeavor, personally. So you will find that I will be contextualizing the Buddhist teachings in the context of the larger Indian teachings in which out of which they emerged. Dar says, churning of oceans might mean spiritual endeavor of man for getting immortality through concentration of mind. It could mean that. It could be many things. I would tend to look at it, if I were to start speculating about it, I would look at it from a Jungian point of view as to the importance of the psychological importance of the libido, the dark unconscious aspects of the self filled with instinctuality and violence and desire. That these are actually that this aspect of the psyche is actually important in the spiritual quest, and that a spiritual quest which does not address these aspects of the psyche is liable to be one-sided, and from a psychoanalytic perspective to result in a compensation, as distinct from those forms of spirituality which want to repress or deny the man's propensity to evil, to put it simply. The Tibetans, in particular, have a deep understanding of this. You will find often in their tantras, you will find antisocial and symbology, which can be very, very graphic and even violent. And every Tibetan temple, if you go into the basement, you will find a temple dedicated to the dark or wrathful aspect of the deity, which is being to which the upper part of the temple is dedicated. And from a Jungian perspective, this is a sign of psychological health, whereas the attempt to pursue the spiritual quest by repressing one's predisposition to evil simply results in the re-emergence of those dark and negative potentialities of the psyche in other guises. And you see this in the Semitic traditions, and you also see this in the Theravadan traditions as well. They tend to become subject to what's called in psychoanalysis a compensation. I'm just looking at the chat. Is the innocence and immediacy of children a Buddhist ideal? That's an interesting question. I presume it is, but I don't know of any specific references, other than, of course, the Buddha's own childhood. I don't know of any, I can't think of any references to children as such in the Pali Canon. There probably are references somewhere. I'll keep my eyes peeled for that, and if I find anything about children, I'll bring it up again. I would presume, I mean, I see no reason why Buddhists would not cherish the innocence and purity of children. Of course, it's complicated a little bit by the fact that they're the results of vast karmic processes that go back in infinite time. So children aren't really as innocent and pure as we imagine them to be, which again, interestingly, conforms with Western psychology. Since Freud, we know that children have sexuality. We know that children are selfish and have capacity for evil. So they have this aspect as well, and I think that would have to be recognized from a karmic perspective. But at the same time, there is an innocence and a purity to them that I assume was reflected in Buddhism, but I can't cite an example. Dar says, okay, as in controlling of desires, perhaps. Not quite sure what you're referring to. Could you elaborate that question a little bit? I'd be happy to address it, but I need to understand it first. Maya Phoenix asks, and Glow, aren't children psychologically immature? How could this be ideal? Well, yes, I'm thinking of that too. So I don't really have any answer to that because I can't think of any examples of children in the Buddhist texts, but I'm sure there are. But one can certainly apply first principles to it. What are children from a Buddhist perspective? They're simply beings who have been recently reborn as a result of past karma, and because of their birth in a relatively low state, they don't, most of the time, they don't recall their past lives. There are exceptions to that. So they would probably have mixed qualities. They would have mixed positive and good, evil qualities just like everyone else. And they are, as you say, immature. Maya Phoenix says, children apparently start lying at the age of 3. There you go. Jospe asks, it is like waiting a razor-edge sharp path between the opposites, which is essence of the dualistic realm. Yes. And of course, it's the whole thing with the Devas and the Asuras is very interesting because it implies that in primordial time, there was no distinction between Devas and Asuras. That they lived together on top of Mount Simaru, and that they coexisted, and that together they constituted the realm of the 33 gods. Then, in the history of Indian spirituality, during the late Vedic period, during this period when Soma was being forgotten and religion was becoming external and authoritarian, there's this split between the two, and one group is victorious over the other. And Buddhism is complicit in that. So what this correlates to, I mean, there's probably a lot of additional research that you could do and find all sorts of correlations. You could find correlations between the doctrine of the once and the twice born, between in the development of Indian spirituality. There was a period at first when power and sensuality and worldliness was enjoyed and embraced and celebrated. And then there was a turning against. There's a recognition that the life eats life is the essential nature of existence. And there was a turning against existence. And Indian spirituality became very ascetic. So perhaps that is related to this. There's all sorts of possibilities. It would be something that would be very interesting to research. Perhaps someone has. Perhaps there's a book on this topic. But I can't really talk more about it in an intelligent way without doing further research. So, as I was saying, Sanat Kumara is one of the 4 Kumaras, 4 sages or rishis who wander the universe together as divine children. They are the first, and this is Brahmanism, of course, this is not Buddhism, but it's relevant because Sanat Kumara is mentioned in the text. They are the first mind-born creations and sons of Brahma. Contrary to Brahma's wishes, they are celibate, or brahmacharya teachers. They are also listed among 12 great devotees, or Mahajanas of Bhakti, and are associated with Krishna and sometimes with Shiva. Sanat Kumara, along with his three brothers, named Sanaka, Sanatana, and Sanandana, is mentioned in the Mahabharata as one of the 7 sages or rishis, the transmitters of the Veda. The Sanat Kumara Samhita is attributed to him. He is also a yoga preceptor and an advocate of the religion of inward contemplation, or Nivriti, referred to in the Bhagavad Gita, in addition to advocating Buddhism. So here you see the reason for the inclusion in the Pali Canon. The redactors of the Pali Canon are saying that this great deity of the Indian tradition, of the Hindu tradition, although Hinduism didn't exist as such during the time of the Buddha, but this great Vedic deity is affirming the truth of the Dharma. And this is further evidence of the relationship between Buddhism and Brahmanism, which has actually come up recently as a topic in Reddit, interestingly, where someone is actually, there's a discussion going on about my blog on was the Buddha a shaman? And this very question was being discussed, this question of the relationship between Buddhism and Brahmanism. But in addition to advocating Buddhism, Sanat Kumara is also associated with Sankhya philosophy, which, as I've mentioned in a previous talk, was founded by Kapila, the founder of Kapila Vastu, the capital city of the Shakyans and the place where the Buddha grew up. And many people believe that the Buddha was influenced by Kapila. The form that Sanat Kumara assumes is that of Panchasika, a male youth beloved of the gods, floating cross-legged in the air, who praises the Buddha and the Dharma. Since no one offers him a seat, he multiplies himself into 33 duplicates of his physical form, each of which sits down on the seat already occupied by each of the 33 gods. Therefore, in effect, each god form assumes the god form of Sanat Kumara Panchasika. He declares that those who take refuge in the triple jewel and follow the precepts will be reborn in one of the realms of the world of sense desires, but no lower than the realm of the 4 great kings. This is unusual in that other suttas declare that human rebirth is the best for an aspirant, but perhaps this is included is implicit in the fact that he is a stream enterer, as we've already learned. The voice of Brahma is described as distinct, intelligible, pleasant, attractive, compact, concise, deep, and resonant. Each of the 33 devas at whose seats Sanat Kumara was sitting feels that he speaks to them alone. And I'm just looking at the chat. I don't see any question marks. I just see assertions. So thank you very much for those contributions, but I'm going to carry on. So now let's discuss the 4 roads to power, which is the next topic discussed in the Sutta. Sanat Kumara reunifies his form and sits on the seat of Saka, as I mentioned, the chief of the 33 gods. He declares that the Buddha has discovered the 4 roads to power, and these consist of 4 practices: concentration of intention, concentration of energy, concentration of consciousness, and concentration of investigation. I'll just put those in the chat. Each of these practices is accompanied by an effort of will. Sanat Kumara presents this practice as the universal key to realization practiced by all ascetics and Brahmins of the past, present, and future. Thus, here we have in the Sutta a declaration of the essential key of Dharma practice, and for that reason very interesting. Different practices, exercises I mentioned in different places. Some are associated specifically with the enlightenment of the Buddha. The mindfulness of breathing, for example, is called the Tathagata's dwelling, which gives it a special place or a preeminent place amongst the practices. Here, this practice called the 4 roads to power is presented as being that, as being the essential practice. Moreover, these practices are all directed towards the development of psychic powers, or idis, in addition to realization. And in my opinion, here we see another sign, yet another sign of a proto-tantric element in the Pali Canon. Those of you who have been attending my talks may have noticed that I've mentioned this from time to time. Orthodoxy says that Tantra is way past the Pali Canon and that Tantra has nothing to do with the Pali Canon, certainly, and many would say with nothing to do with Buddhism as well. But if you really study the Pali Canon, closely, you'll find a lot of evidence which contradicts this, what I consider to be a naive, simplistic, and overly academic view. Next, we'll discuss the three gateways to bliss. And so he declares the three gateways to the bliss of a Buddha, namely, and I'll put these in the chat too. So what we're getting now is a list of core practices, if you like, presented in a fairly overview way. You will notice that the specifics of practice are not being revealed here, only the essential outline of practice. If you say Tantra, of course, there's the practice, and then there's the theory that underlies the practice, which can be summarized in a very abstract level, but you really have to understand the practice and then know the techniques themselves in order to practice the practice. These were presumably oral traditions which were lost, and the practices themselves are being summarized in the Pali Canon, but there would have been a lot of lore, a lot of oral tradition, and actual practice that would have been communicated from a guru to his disciples, in addition to what's revealed in the Pali Canon. So this also gives the lie to the notion that the Pali Canon is complete. The Buddha himself says the Pali Canon is not complete, and these texts support that view. A Glow Phoenix asks, how can the reliance on will, which binds one with karma, be the key to Buddhist practices? Will does not necessarily bind you to karma. Will or intention is the cause of karma, but it can also be turned. Will, yes, it's a psychic energy. It can be. It is bound, because will is bound up with samsara. Therefore, one is bound by samsara. But it is also the will that gives one the volition, the freedom, to withdraw from that bondage and therefore attain liberation. And this is referred to the importance of will, the effort of will, intention, manly energy, virya, manly energy, is also emphasized throughout the Pali Canon. So you're defining will as necessarily and inherently bound up with karma, and that's actually not quite true. Will certainly is bound up with karma, but it doesn't have to be. One can formulate the will to transcend karma, the will to transcend samsara as well, and by the application of that intention, one can achieve transcendence. Will, energy, intention, volition, I'm conflating all of those things. And this is actually the point in the human being where we are one with reality itself, where we are one with the infinite, because only the unconditioned can have intention. Everything else is subject to something else and therefore conditioned. But reality, the ultimate, the absolute, whatever term you want to give it, cannot be subject to anything else, and therefore it is inherently volitional. And it is that very volitionalness of reality which is the cause, if you like, that's really not a proper word, but which is the primordial ignorance that is the basis of the whole thing. If you think about it in its ground, reality can't have any content, and therefore it has to be ignorant, and through its ignorance it becomes bound up with samsara, and then it awakens and transcends samsara. This is the universal process. So, the 3 gateways to bliss, did I put the 3 gateways to bliss in the chat? Yes, I did. He declares the 3 gateways to the bliss of a Buddha, namely dissociation from sense desires and unwholesome conditions, allaying the gross tendencies of body, speech, and mind, and knowing what is right and wrong based on the law of karma. You'll notice all these things are acts of will: dissociating, allaying, knowing. These are all acts of will. The 3 gateways to bliss develop gladness and knowledge. Next, he discusses the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which I'll also put in the chat. He declares the 4 foundations of mindfulness, in which one contemplates body as body, feelings as feelings, mind as mind, mind objects as mind objects. And the 4 foundations of mindfulness develop concentration, calm, serenity, knowledge, and vision. And with respect to the mindfulness of the body, I see someone who just sent me something. With respect to mindfulness of the body, I would reiterate something I've mentioned in previous talks that's quite interesting, is that apparently, according to Buddhaghosa, the great Buddhist commentator of the 5th century, Theravadin, I believe, as well, he notes that the concept of mindfulness of the body is an innovation of the Buddha and originates with the Buddha. So this shows the importance of the body in the Buddhist schema of salvation. So Aglow Phoenix asks, like Tantra, we are released by that which binds. Yes. Yes, exactly. That's exactly the origin of that doctrine. That's the whole Deva Asura thing that we were talking about earlier, that in the Jungian psychoanalytic, depth psychological view, the darkness, the shadow, which is the term he used for it, the shadow is necessary. It's a necessary aspect of the process, and trying to aspire to a higher and higher states of consciousness without assimilating and transforming that energy makes one liable to what is called a compensation. It's an imbalance of the psyche, where this repressed material that is repressed and denied reemerges in other forms. We see this in orthodox religiosity all the time. This is, of course, the tantric insight. And as those of you, most of you are by now realize, this is not this interpretation of the Pali Canon that I'm presenting to you, while literal in the sense that it's based on a deep analysis of the texts, is by no means a sectarian Theravadan interpretation. As you can also infer from my Buddhist name as well. And of course, Theravadins will have a very different view about much of this, of course. The going on to the 7 requisites of concentration, which I'll also put in the chat. And of course, this is all going to be available on Notepad as well as on my blog, for those of you who are interested in going over it again, and perhaps in the context of the Sutta. He declares the 7 requisites of concentration, namely right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, and right mindfulness. Does that list remind anyone of anything? Little quiz. We'll have a little one-question quiz. Right view, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, called the 7 requisites of concentration. Does that remind anyone of anything? Yes. Balaji Nirvana got it. Oh, Argus Portal got it. Dar got it. And Balaji Nirvana got it. And probably Josen Momoko got it as well. The similarity to the Noble Eightfold Path is obvious. A question that has arisen in past talks with respect to the Noble Eightfold Path is the significance of the numbered sequence as a sequence, that is, do the tasks corresponding to the limbs of the Noble Eightfold Path represent a graduated path? This has been contrasted with the threefold classification, as it's called, attributed to the nun Dhammadinna, which appears to imply a different order from the Noble Eightfold Path. This is, of course, the sequence of morality, meditation, and wisdom, which is used by Theravadins and other religious Buddhists often. I'm not going to go into depth on this because I have discussed this before, but I'm going to note the strong emphasis on the sequence of the 7 requisites for concentration, which clearly correspond to the limbs of the Noble Eightfold Path. In the case of the Noble Eightfold Path, they're called the first, second, third, etc. They're numbered. Each requisite establishes the necessary basis for the next. This is explicit in this sutta. Each requisite establishes the necessary basis for the next. So the requisites clearly must be attained in order, confirming Peter Macefield's and my own hypothesis. I claim no credit for it. It's Peter Macefield who actually, as far as I know, first brought this up at any length. In his very excellent book, Divine Revelation in the Pali Canon, which I recommend and have mentioned from time to time, our hypothesis that the proper sequence of the threefold classification should be wisdom, morality, and meditation, culminating in the higher concentration, knowledge, and liberation, to use the language of this particular sutta. Whereas normally the threefold classification is given, as I mentioned, in the sequence, morality, meditation, and wisdom, which is used by by monastics as a justification or explanation of their system, starting, of course, with morality, the Vinaya. From right mindfulness arise right concentration, right knowledge, and right liberation, corresponding to the 8th limb of the Noble Eightfold Path, right concentration. The 7 requisites of concentration give us greater insight into the construction or structure of the Noble Eightfold Path. He declares that the Dharma is timeless, capable of rational apprehension and analysis by each individual for himself, and progressive. He reiterates a continuous refrain of the Pali Canon, "Open are the doors of the deathless," which decisively negates any notion that the Buddha taught anything less than personal immortality. Quoting, "For indeed, my lords," this is of course Sanat-Kumara speaking, "for indeed, my lords, the Dhamma is well proclaimed by the Lord, visible here and now, timeless, inviting inspection, leading onward to be comprehended by the wise, each one for him or herself, and 2, the doors to the deathless are open," unquote. Interestingly, access to the doors to the deathless appears to be non-gender specific, assuming that Walsh's translation is faithful to the Pali. I plan to look more closely at this, as well as at the Pali underlying the intriguing phrase, leading onward. In what sense does Dharma lead onward? Is Dharma attractive? Does it induce an evolutionary tendency or direction? Is it educational or therapeutic? Is it ontological? Finally, Sanat-Kumara affirms the doctrine of the Buddha lineage, namely that Buddhas have arisen in the past and will arise again in the future. So, to conclude, unlike most other suttas in the Pali Canon, this sutta is an explicit spirit teaching, like similar productions in Tibetan Buddhist and Taoist traditions especially. The teaching of Sanat-Kumara is transmitted to the 33 Devas, who transmit it in a descending hierarchy to a Vesawana, who relates it to his followers. Vesawana, you'll recall, is the chief guardian of the north, of the realm of the 4 great kings. So he transmits it to Vesawana, who relates it to his followers, including Janavasabha. Janavasabha is King Bimbisara of Magadha, reborn as a king in the realm of the 4 great kings. Janavasabha, noticing to a higher dimensional spiritual being, the minds of human beings are open books, so he notices what the Buddha is thinking about, which is, as you'll recall from the beginning, the future rebirths of the Magadhans, including King Bimbisara. He transmits it to the Buddha, who confirms its coherence with his own realization, and that's an important point to note, who in turn then transmits it to Ananda. So this has the form of a tantric initiation, a tantric style initiatory transmission. Ananda transmits it to male and female monastics and lay followers or householders, and it's interesting to note the emphasis on that's non-gender specific. I've talked in the past about misogyny in the Pali Canon, but there is also a non-misogynistic tradition that's also clearly expressed throughout the Pali Canon, emphasizing we see the inclusion of both genders. Clearly, the concept of initiatory transmission is implied, which we also find in later traditions of the Tantric type especially, and also Mahayana. The end of the sutta is also unique. Most suttas end with the phrase, "Thus the Lord spoke," or an utterance or an incident, often a conversion, an awakening, or a summary verse. The Janavasabha sutta ends with the words, quote, "And so the holy life waxed mighty and prospered and spread widely as it was proclaimed among mankind," unquote. One expects this sort of revelatory ending from a communication of this type. And I consider this sutta further confirmation of my thesis, which I initially, when we began this series of talks, I initially was somewhat tentative in my hypothesizing that there is a proto-tantric element in the Pali Canon. Now, as I find more and more evidence of this, I become emboldened, and I am now willing to state that I find in this sutta to be further confirmation of my thesis that there is a proto-tantric element in the Pali Canon. That concludes my talk for today. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm now happy to consider any questions or discussion that anyone would like to have before we proceed to the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk, whatever merit may have been generated by this talk, to all beings. So, any discussion or questions anyone would like to ask? And also, I'll just mention again that the note card of this talk is available, both from me personally and also from the library in Zhuangzhou, which is located in the middle, the center of the Visit Atoll Sim. If you go to the center of the Sim, you'll see a Shaolin temple. If you go to the second floor, you'll see a library. In the library, you'll see a bookcase, and if you click it, all of the items that I've presented at the Buddha Center, as well as other additional items from my blog and elsewhere, are available. About 75 items are available in the bookcase. And Momoko has very kindly pasted the landmark into the chat. So, I see a question. Jospe asks, how would you value the word life in the last sentence of the sutta? Let me just look at it again. And so the holy life waxed mighty and prospered and spread widely as it was proclaimed among mankind. What does he mean by holy life? I would say he means narrowly. I would say he means the life, the practice of the Vinaya, the practice of hyper-concentration, hyper-vigilance, actually it's called, which is essentially what the Vinaya is all about. It's a set of rules which are designed to promote mindfulness. The word Vinaya means something like hyper-mindfulness, hyper-awareness, and probably more broadly, the life of those who pursue the Buddhist praxis, either householders or monastics. So that's how I would interpret it. Thank you very much for the compliment, Glow Phoenix. I won't be egotistical enough to read it. Dar says, I have a note card for the 4 jhanas, as well as that I think is relevant to this talk. If you would like, I can share it if anyone would like. Sure. And if you want to put it in the library in Zhuangzhou, then I would be happy to put it in the library in Zhuangzhou as well for you. if you would like to do that. Josospe asks, I see, your question was a lead-in. You're trying to catch me. So life seems essential. Samsara, the function of samsara. In the orthodox religious view, samsara is a pure negative. It's illusory. It doesn't exist. It has no beneficial aspects, and it is something to be transcended and gotten rid of. However, the fact that samsara is beginningless, and also if you read in the vows, the religious vows, for example, the Bodhisattva vow, one vows to help all beings until samsara ends. So that it posits the idea of an ending to samsara, not just an ending to samsara from the individual perspective, the perspective of the person who transcends samsara, but an end to samsara itself in an ontological sense, if you want to put it that way, although, of course, from that perspective, samsara is not ontological. It's the negation of ontology. It's illusory. It's a mirage. I've talked about this in my talks called Fundamental View at some length. I can't possibly recap everything I've said there. But it does seem that this view is naive because the Buddha posits samsara as beginningless. It doesn't seem possible for samsara to ever cease to exist. Plus, the origin of samsara, which is ignorance, is posited as the primary quality of reality itself. So, even though samsara is illusory, even an illusion exists in some sense, in the sense in which that it is experienced. Even a mirage exists in some sense, in the sense that it is a false image of something real, particularly a mirage. So samsara seems to have this relationship to reality. It's the negation of reality, but it's also posited by reality as its own negation, as in order to establish reality in its transdual aspect, it has to have this dual character of samsara and nirvana, which both are resolved into reality, the primary characteristic of which is ignorance. So from that, it does seem that samsara does have some kind of function. We can't speak of a teleology because reality can have no teleology, because it is everything, so it needs nothing. Teleology implies an end which is different from what one is, and an aspiration towards something which is different, a realization of something which is different from what one is. But reality itself, the totality, the absolute being, can have no teleology because it's not anything. But it does seem that samsara does have some kind of function in the context of reality, and that function seems to be the attainment of transcendence. So I guess that's a lengthy answer to your question. Is life essential? Yes, I would say samsara is essential in some sense. That it does fulfill some kind of function, and thus it can be worked with. It can be engaged in a meaningful way in the context of the spiritual life. And this, again, is the importance of recognizing the spirituality of the dark side, as it were, which the Tibetans and the Tantrics emphasize, and which Jung emphasized as well. In fact, Jung says that because of its inability to recognize this truth, Christianity, with its hypostasization of Satan, because Christians do exactly the same thing with Satan. They say Satan is absolute evil, to be rejected, to be repressed, and of course Satan comes back in the Semitic traditions in some form, in the form of the enemy, the other, which is demonized, which all the Semitic traditions is a way of thinking which all of the Semitic traditions engage in. And then, so they're overwhelmed by their own repressed, unacknowledged evil. And exoteric Buddhism, religious Buddhism, is no different. Maya Phoenix asks, what library? The library it's the library located in the Visit Atoll Sim, which is the home of Zhuangzung, the Sim of the Dharma Transmission to the West group, which is my group in Second Life. And if you're interested in following my activities in Second Life, I encourage you to join that group. We have a sim. It's there. If you go to the center of it, you'll find a temple called the Shaolin Temple. If you go into it, go up to the second story, you'll see two doors. Walk through the doors, you'll see a library with bookcases. If you click the bookcase, you will see all the note cards available through a menu system. And Maya Phoenix asks for the LM to be posted. It's been posted. What then is the holy life? I think that's been asked and answered. All of samsara and nirvana are one. Reality as it is, yes, the glow phoenix, that is the Mahayana view. Also the Tantric view, Tantra being simply a subcategory of Mahayana. It is not the view of the Theravadins, who believe, according to Bhikkhu Bodhi, in an article, in an essay he wrote in 1999, or so, late 90s anyway, Theravada is dualistic. He says that Theravada posits ontological dualism, but from the esoteric perspective, from the Mahayana and Vajrayana perspective, that is true. So nirvana exists. Nirvana and samsara are one, and they are also two. And because they are two, they are resolved in the ultimate reality, which is transdual. This is a view which Bhikkhu Bodhi criticized in his essay in the late 90s when he was living in a Theravadin monastery in Sri Lanka. However, I'm not sure this would be his view today, because in his most recent translations from the Pali Canon, he recognizes two non-Theravadin doctrines in the Pali Canon, and he himself has left Sri Lanka and is now living in a Chinese Mahayana monastery in New Jersey, of all places. So whether he would hold the view, that dualistic view today, I don't know. You'd have to ask him that. But I do wonder about that, whether he would continue to hold that view, because he does seem to be opening himself up to non-Theravada perspectives on some aspects of the Dharma. Dar says, none are born already awakened. That's true, because if you're awakened, you wouldn't be born. So if by already awakened you mean that in its purest and ultimate sense, that is correct. No one who is once one achieves Tathagatahood and achieves ultimate emancipation, there is no rebirth. Okay, any further questions or discussion before we proceed to the dedication of merit? And for those who are, don't forget to ask me for a copy of the note card if you would like one. And for those who are interested, I'll be heading over to Zhuangzhung after this talk for a short while, but I'm doing a test. I'm writing an editorial test right now, which I have to finish this evening, so I won't be able to stay too long, but I can stay there for a little while. Okay, it seems no one has any more questions, and I'm getting requests for copies of the note cards, so perhaps this is the moment for the dedication of merit. Whatever understanding, whatever positive force has come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege. I will return next Sunday at 2 p.m. Second Lifetime, where we will be discussing the 19th Sutta of the Digha Nikaya in our series on the Digha Nikaya. Thank you very much. Namaskar.